Hello everyone, and welcome to my fourth video. Today, I want to show you what you can do as a developer to validate the data that is imported to Flatfile against the data that is in your database. Here's a simple use case. Imagine that you or your users import data to Flatfile, and that data will contain an email field. You want to make sure that the emails that a user imports do not already exist in your database. If they do, you want to throw an error on such emails and tell a user to audit the data before they submit it to you. First, we'll take a look at the workflow so you can see exactly how it looks like, and then we'll take a look at the code so I can show you what exactly am I doing to make that use case possible. Once I show you how you can validate the data, after that I prepared a little bit of a bonus content for you to show you what more can you do in addition to that workflow to make it even more complete. Please remember that as we go through this video, all the links to the Flatfile documentation on concepts we'll discuss, and a link to the public GitHub repository with the example file and the code are available to you in the description of this video. So without further ado, let's get started. First, let's take a look at the workflow. Over here, I have my Flatfile importer where I will upload the data. And in this tab, I have a Google Sheets file that I'm using as an example of my database. In that Google Sheets, you will notice that I have an email field with 4 emails over there. So when I'll import data to Flatfile, I want to make sure that that data I import does not contain any of the emails in this Google Sheets file. So let's take a look. In my Flatfile importer, I've already imported that file, so we'll just click Import button over here. After we map the incoming fields to the fields that we've defined, we can click on the Continue button. The data will load in Flatfile, and it will be validated against our database. Notice that all the emails that are shown as errors over here are exactly those emails that are present in the Google Sheets file. And we're giving a clear direction to the user that says, this email already exists in the system, please audit. Also notice that I am disabling the Submit button until all records are valid. That is how you can make sure that a user sanitizes all the data before they actually submit it to your database. Over here, I will copy a valid email and just paste it to the cells with errors to make all the data valid. And notice now that I will paste that last email, the Submit button on the top right will become clickable. So when I paste it, the data processes, and now I can actually click on the Submit button here. We're going to go through this message over here later. That is the part of the bonus content. But once the user confirms the action, we can see the status that the data has been submitted. And when we check our sample database, we can see that indeed we have received the payload that the user sent to us. So now that we know how the user workflow looks like, let's take a look at the code. The public GitHub repository with all this code and an example file is available to you in the description of this video. So let's take a look at the code that powers up our use case. In the top, you'll notice that I have my Flatfile dashboard, and on the bottom, I have my code. So the first thing I'm doing is importing all the necessary packages for the code to execute. And then the first thing I'm doing is defining my webhook receiver. This is a unique URL where the data will be sent once the user clicks on the Submit button over here. Then I'm defining the main Flatfile event listener function, inside of which I have 4 separate listeners that are all responsible for their own thing. We got the first listener here that executes when we create a space. The second listener executes to validate the data. The third listener is associated with a bonus content that I'll cover at the end of the video. And then the fourth listener here is responsible for submitting data to our webhook site. So before we even take a look at the first listener, notice that I'm filtering my code to only execute on the app that has app1 namespace on it. So what that means is in my Flatfile dashboard over here, I'm currently located on app 1. I can create multiple apps inside of the dashboard, but I want this code only to run on the app 1 namespace. To verify, over here on app 1, I can click on the edit icon and I can verify that indeed the namespace here matches the namespace by which I'm filtering my code. That is how I know that the code will execute for this specific importer because it is a part of app 1 app. So let's take a look at my first listener. So over here, I've already created a space, and that is exactly what we're doing in the first listener. We're creating a space with the components that we need. So the first thing we do is fetch the necessary information out of the event context for the code to run. And then before we do anything, we first acknowledge the job. Acknowledging the job first is important because if you're doing complicated code as the space is being created, the job might time out. If you acknowledge the job in the beginning, you will make sure that that job doesn't time out as the space is being created. Once we acknowledge the job, we make an API call to create a workbook with the name workbook1, as you can see here in my Flatfile dashboard, and then as sheets, we attach workbook1 variable to it. That workbook1 variable lives over here. You'll notice that it is a simple sheet config that we're creating with 3 fields, first name, last name, and email address, and then we're just exporting it as workbook1 variable. We see that sheet over here with 3 fields at the top of the screen. Now that we created a workbook and we defined what sheet we're creating, last but not least, we're going to create that submit button over here. And the way we create it is using several parameters. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can do that at your leisure as all the code has comments and is available to you. But some of the main things here are we're giving the label to that submit action called submit, as you can see above over here. We're making it primary, meaning that it is going to be more visible over here on the top right. We are going to disable that button until there's some data included in the sheet. So notice here, because there is no data included here, I cannot click on the submit button. And also, until all records are valid, that submit button will remain not clickable. So once I create a space that contains my workbook, the sheets that I defined, and the submit action, I'm gonna complete the job if everything goes well, and then if something goes wrong as the space is being created, we're gonna throw an error with a message to check event logs. So that is all that the first listener is responsible for, is creating a space with the components that we need. Inside of the second listener, we're gonna do 2 key things. The first thing is we're going to authorize the API calls from Flatfile to Google Sheets file. And then the second thing we're going to do is validate that the data we actually import does not already exist in the Google Sheets file. Or if it does, we're going to throw an error. But before we look inside of the code of that second listener, we're going to check out Flatfile dashboard for an important concept. So in my dashboard over here, you see there is a tab called API Keys and Secrets. To validate the data against my Google Sheets file, I needed to do something to authorize against Google Sheets. So to do that, I'm leveraging Flatfile's secrets functionality. So in the API Keys and Secrets, I added the necessary secrets over here so that I can fetch them in my code very securely and then validate the API calls to the Google Sheets to validate the data. In the code, you will see that I'm accessing those secrets, but I wanted to show you that if you're building a proof of concept or you're exploring this as a new use case, you can leverage Flatfile's secrets feature to store your secrets in your production environment and then access them in the code safely through an API. So let's see how this looks like. In my second listener here, again, the first thing I'm doing is fetching the environment ID. out of the event context, and then I'm making an API call to fetch the secrets for this environment. That will return me all the secrets that are stored there, and then I'm going to store my client email secret inside of its own variable, my private key inside of its own variable, and then also I'm going to store the spreadsheet ID in the Google Sheets API that I'm fetching inside of its variable as well. So all of those are already stored. Here you will see client email, 2 parts of the private key, and the Google Sheets spreadsheet ID. I'm just fetching those from the dashboard and saving them as their own variable. One cool thing I'm doing, in case you will run into this, at the time of this video, Flatfile limits the length of the secret to 1024 characters. But then the private key to access the Google Sheets via API is about 1800 characters. So I just split it into 2 in my dashboard over here, and then in the code you will see that I'm simply combining them under the private key full variable. I'm not going to go through all the code here because I'm just doing authorization against the Google Sheets API to make sure I can access the data. But then later on, you will see that I'm fetching the data inside of the Google Sheets, and I'm specifying that I just want to fetch column C inside of my Google Sheets. If we look into it, the column C is the one with the email addresses. Since I'm only validating the email addresses in my use case, I don't need the other information. After that, we're going to utilize the bulk record hook function that Flatfile provides. We've defined it here at the very top of our listener. That bulk record hook is going to run on our contacts sheet and is going to validate the data. So the first thing we're doing is we're fetching the email fields from our Flatfile sheet. So if we import the file that I actually already imported here, map the fields, and then the data will load in the Flatfile table. I'm fetching all those email values over here using record get method and storing it as an email value. And then I'm just doing a very simple if statement that says if the emails that are in Flatfile, so inside of this variable, already exist in the Google Sheets file, those values are stored here, we're going to add an error to those records with the message, this email already exists in the system, please audit. And that is how those rows here are showing an error because we're specifying that if statement. We're returning the record, and then if something goes wrong, we're going to console log an error so that we can debug further. So that is what the second listener is responsible for. It validates the data inside of our Flatfile table against the data that is already present in the Google Sheets file. Let's go ahead and validate the data because we're not actually able to click on this button until all the data in the table is valid. So I'll just copy this email address and paste it over the fields that are invalid to make all the data valid. And you will notice that once I paste the email over here, the submit button will again become clickable. Here we go, all the data validated, and we can now click on that button. Once we click on it, that is when the last listener will execute, so let's take a look at it. I am purposefully skipping this listener here. This is a part of the bonus content I'll talk about at the end of the video. So inside of the last listener, you will notice that I'm filtering for the job, submit action, that is on the workbook level. So over here, the first thing we do is always we fetch all the information we need out of the event context. And because this is a custom action, again, we first acknowledge the job. After that, we're gonna fetch all the sheets that are associated with our workbook, in this case, just the context sheet, and then we're gonna define an empty records array. Currently it is empty, but once this for loop executes, which looks at all the sheets that we're submitting, and it retrieves all the records for each sheet, and then it is going to populate this records array with that information. Once all of that is done, we're going to execute a post Axios call to send the data to our sample database, which in this case is Webhook receiver. Remember, we defined our Webhook receiver over here as a unique link where we're sending the data. We're going to set records to it, and once all the data is sent, we're going to complete the job if everything goes well, and if something breaks in the process, we're going to fail the job with a specific message. So let's see how it looks like. Once we submit the data here, that code will execute. We'll get a success message that the data has been submitted successfully. And we see over here that indeed, we've received all the information from that sheet. So by this point in the video, you have all the information you need to set up your use case. You've seen that you can import data to Flatfile, validate it against your external database, and then if any records in Flatfile already exist in your database, you can throw an error to the user with a specific message to correct the data before they're able to submit that data to you. So by now you have all the information you need to actually set up that use case yourself. Right now, I'm just gonna go over the bonus content I prepared that is my opinion of how you can enrich your use case even more. So if you don't need the bonus content, you're good to stop here. You got a public GitHub repository in the description of this video. But if you're interested and want to see what more you can do on top of the use case I've already described, please keep on watching. So for the bonus content, one thing I want to focus on is on another custom action that is a part of this Flatfile dashboard, and that is final validation. You will see that I included the description for that custom action that says that this validates a data one final time to make sure that all records are valid before a user submits them. Now, because this action is on the sheet level, I am also creating it over here in the same place where I'm defining my fields. So I first defined the fields first name, last name, and email, and then I defined that sheet level action. Again, I'm not going to go through all the parameters. You can do that at your leisure because you have access to the code. But some of the main things here are the operation name is final validation. You'll see that this is exactly what we're going to reference here in our third listener. Then we're giving it a label final validation, as you can see over here. It is going to be primary action, which means it is not going to be stored under the drop-down actions here, but it is going to live on its own inside of the toolbar here. A user has to confirm the action before they click on it. And then this text over here that explains what the action is about to do lives on the description parameter over here. You will see that similar to the submit action, we keep this final validation action disabled until there is any data in the sheet and until all the data in the sheet is already valid. Now, what is the purpose of it? You will notice over here that I only have a file with 9 emails. Let's say you have a file that has 10,000 emails, and while you're validating all the emails, we might have received already new email entries over here in the database. So some of the records that appear valid now might no longer be valid. Let's consider this as an example. I'm going to copy an email here, samgross@gmail.com, that is valid right now. If I'm going to paste it down here, it will again be valid because that email does not exist in Google Sheets file. But if I paste it here, so now it exists in the Google Sheets, and I paste it again in the Flatfile dashboard, you will see that the last entry is invalid, but that entry is valid. And that is expected. As we went over it, bulk record hook function validates the data that is in the Flatfile dashboard. It validates the data the first time we import that data after the mapping stage, and then on every record change. So when a record is changed, the bulk record hook function will only execute on that record, meaning on that row. because we did not change any data here, the bulk record hook did not validate that email. That is why once we correct this email here, for example to hello@hello.com, and then we run the final validation action, it is going to invalidate that email here because that action here will execute on the entire sheet. So as we say in the description here, data will be validated one final time. If any records are still invalid, please audit them. So as we click confirm, the following code will run in the third listener. The first thing we do is we fetch all the information out of the event context that we need. As we mentioned before, because this is a custom job, we first acknowledge it. After that, I'm gonna fetch the workbook information using the get workbook API call, and out of that, I'm gonna extract the sheet ID of that context sheet here. I need that sheet ID because I'm then gonna pass it to the API sheets validate call. This is the line that revalidates the entire sheet before the action is complete. And once the entire sheet is revalidated, we complete the job, and then if something goes wrong, we fail a job with a specific message. So let's see how it works. When I click this confirm button, that code executes, sheet gets revalidated, and you will see that now samgross@gmail.com is again invalid, and what's more, the submit action is again not clickable because there is more data to correct. So as we correct that data here and all that data becomes valid, we can click on the submit button and a user is asked if they ran final validation action before clicking on submit. I didn't rerun it again after I changed the records. So I'll rerun it again. We'll make sure that all the records continue to be valid, and they are. And now we can go ahead and submit that data to our sample database. Once we get the confirmation message here that that has been done, we can indeed see that we've received all the data that the user tried to submit. This is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching it, especially if you made it through the bonus content. Please remember that all the use case, everything we went through, is available to you. There's a public GitHub repository that is attached to the description of this video. It includes the file, it includes the code, it includes everything you need. I've also attached all the relevant Flatfile documentation on the key concepts I covered through the video. And please remember that I'm releasing the new videos at least once a month. So if you're enjoying the content, please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.